My name is Sophia Martinez, and I'm 28 years old. Standing in my father's living room with my 3-year-old daughter Emma clinging to my leg, I never imagined those would be the last words my own blood would speak to me with any trace of love. The pregnancy test results clutched in my trembling hand felt like a death sentence as my father's face turned purple with rage, his voice echoing through our modest home while my mother sobbed silently in the corner. That was the moment I realized my own blood saw me as their biggest shame. Before we dive into this story that changed everything, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button if you believe everyone deserves a second chance. Make sure to subscribe and ring the bell because this journey gets much more intense, and you won't want to miss what happens when I finally fought back against the family that tried to destroy me. The nightmare didn't start with my second pregnancy announcement. It began 3 years earlier when I was 25 and foolishly believed that love could conquer anything. My first boyfriend, Jake, had promised me forever, painted pictures of our future together, and filled my young heart with dreams of a perfect family. When I discovered I was pregnant with Emma, I expected surprise, maybe some initial panic, but certainly not the complete abandonment that followed. Jake disappeared the moment I showed him the pregnancy test, blocking my number and moving out of state within a week. I learned through mutual friends that he'd been seeing someone else for months, and my pregnancy was apparently the perfect excuse to make his escape official. My family's reaction to that first pregnancy had been disappointing but manageable. My father, Roberto, a hardworking construction company owner who'd built his business from nothing, had always been strict about maintaining our family's reputation in our tight-knit Catholic community. He'd grumbled about unwed mothers and damaged reputations, but eventually accepted Emma once she arrived. My mother, Carmen, who'd spent 30 years following my father's lead in everything, had cried for weeks but eventually became a devoted grandmother. My sister, Isabella, 3 years older and smugly married to her high school sweetheart with 2 perfect children, had made snide comments about my choices but tolerated my presence at family gatherings. My brother Miguel, the golden child who'd become a successful lawyer, had offered cold legal advice about child support and custody but maintained his distance from what he called my drama. For 3 years, I'd worked hard to rebuild their trust and prove I could be a good mother despite the circumstances. I'd taken night classes while working 2 part-time jobs, struggled to provide for Emma while maintaining my grades, and eventually landed a stable position at a local community center. Emma was thriving, speaking in full sentences, potty-trained, and absolutely adored by everyone who met her. I thought I'd finally earned my place back in the family's good graces. I thought I'd proven that one mistake didn't define my entire worth as a person. Then I met Ryan at a community fundraiser, where I was volunteering. He was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in building a life that included both Emma and me. For 6 months, I experienced what I thought was real love. Ryan brought flowers every Friday, took Emma to the park on weekends, and talked about our future with such conviction that I believed him completely. He met my family, earned my father's grudging approval, and even convinced my mother that I deserved happiness. When I discovered I was pregnant again, I was terrified but hopeful. Surely this time would be different. Surely a man who claimed to love me wouldn't abandon his own child. I was wrong. Ryan's reaction to the pregnancy news was immediate and brutal. He accused me of trying to trap him, claimed the baby couldn't be his despite our exclusive relationship, and demanded I handle the situation quietly. When I refused to terminate the pregnancy, he became cruel, calling me names I won't repeat and threatening to disappear just like Jake had. Within 2 weeks, he'd moved back to his home state, changed his phone number, and effectively vanished from our lives. I was once again facing single motherhood, but this time with a 3-year-old daughter who'd grown attached to the man she'd started calling daddy. The Sunday family dinner where I announced my second pregnancy will haunt me forever. I dressed Emma in her prettiest dress, brought my mother's favorite dessert, and prepared carefully chosen words about how life sometimes brings unexpected blessings. The moment I shared the news, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. My father's face went through several color changes before settling on a deep red that made the veins in his temples bulge visibly. My sister Isabella's mouth fell open in what could only be described as disgusted shock, while my brother Miguel immediately pulled out his phone, probably calculating the financial implications of another family scandal. The explosion came swiftly and mercilessly. My father launched into a tirade about family reputation, neighborhood gossip, and how I was systematically destroying everything he'd worked to build in our community. He used words like disgraceful, shameful, and embarrassing, each one hitting me like a physical blow while Emma cowered behind my legs, confused by the sudden shouting. Isabella joined in with cruel comments about my pattern of bad choices and inability to learn from mistakes, questioning my fitness as a mother and suggesting that maybe Emma would be better off with more stable guardians. Miguel remained coldly quiet until the end, when he offered his legal expertise in language that made it clear he was already distancing himself from whatever chaos was about to unfold. The ultimatum came with devastating clarity. My father stood up, towering over me with 45 years of patriarchal authority, and gave me a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. I could get rid of the pregnancy and beg for the family's forgiveness, or I could get out of his house and never come back. When I refused to terminate my pregnancy, explaining that I couldn't and wouldn't end an innocent life because of their shame, his reaction was volcanic. He stormed through the house, gathering my belongings and Emma's toys, throwing everything onto the front lawn while neighbors watched from their windows and porches. The image of my own father screaming for me to get out while my 3-year-old daughter cried in confusion will never leave my memory. My mother stood silently by the window, tears streaming down her face, but she never said a word in my defense. Miguel offered cold legal advice about cutting ties to protect the family's financial interests, while Isabella actually helped carry our belongings outside, making comments about how I'd finally shown my true colors. That night, I found myself homeless with a toddler and another baby on the way, carrying garbage bags full of our possessions to my friend Lisa's already overcrowded apartment, wondering how the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had become my cruelest enemies. The weeks following my family's brutal rejection blurred together in a haze of desperate survival and crushing anxiety. Lisa's one-bedroom apartment was already home to her own 2 children and occasionally her on-again, off-again boyfriend, making our presence an unwelcome burden despite her generous heart. Emma struggled to understand why we couldn't go home to her own bed, why Grandma and Grandpa didn't want to see her anymore, and why Mommy cried so much when she thought her daughter was sleeping. The pregnancy symptoms intensified under stress, leaving me nauseated and exhausted while trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for Emma's sake. My job situation became precarious almost immediately. The morning sickness, combined with the emotional devastation and lack of stable housing, caused me to miss several shifts at the community center. My supervisor, while sympathetic to my situation, couldn't overlook the attendance issues indefinitely. When I finally lost the position, the unemployment compensation barely covered Emma's basic needs, let alone prenatal care for the growing baby. I found myself standing in line at government assistance offices, filling out humiliating paperwork while bureaucrats treated me like another statistic instead of a human being facing an impossible situation. The phone calls from my mother started 3 weeks after the eviction. Carmen would call when my father was at work, her voice hushed and nervous, asking how Emma was doing and whether I'd reconsidered my situation. She never directly mentioned abortion, but her meaning was clear every time she brought up how much easier life would be with just one child, how much more support the family could provide if I made the right choice. These conversations gave me hope that reconciliation was possible, that somewhere beneath her submission to my father's will, my mother still loved her daughter and granddaughter enough to fight for us. The financial situation became desperate quickly. Lisa's patience was wearing thin as her own bills piled up, and I knew we couldn't stay much longer without contributing substantially to the household expenses. I sold everything of value I owned, from jewelry my grandmother had given me to electronics and furniture I'd worked years to afford. The money disappeared immediately into food, diapers, and the security deposit for a studio apartment in a neighborhood I wouldn't have walked through alone before pregnancy changed my options. Emma's health scare came at the worst possible time, a fever that spiked so high I had to take her to the emergency room, resulting in medical bills I had no way to pay. The eviction notice from our new studio apartment arrived just 6 weeks after we'd moved in. I'd managed to pay the first month's rent, but couldn't scrape together enough for the second month while keeping Emma fed and purchasing prenatal vitamins. The landlord was unsympathetic to my situation, giving me 72 hours to vacate or face formal eviction proceedings that would destroy what remained of my credit. I spent those 3 days frantically calling every resource I could find, from churches to social services, but emergency housing assistance had waiting lists months long, and temporary shelters had age restrictions that separated mothers from children over 2 years old. My mother's solution came at exactly the right moment, or so I thought. Carmen called on a Thursday evening while I was packing our few remaining possessions, offering to arrange a family meeting where everyone could discuss the situation rationally and find a solution that worked for everyone. She spoke about how much my father missed Emma, how Isabella had been asking about her niece, and how Miguel thought there might be legal ways to help if we could all sit down together. Her voice carried such hope and warmth that I allowed myself to believe reconciliation was possible, that love could triumph over pride and reputation concerns. I spent the entire day preparing for that family meeting, bathing Emma until she sparkled and dressing her in the nicest outfit we still owned. I practiced what I would say about accepting responsibility for my choices, while asking for support in raising my children with dignity and love. Emma was excited about seeing her grandparents and cousins again, chattering about all the things she wanted to tell them, and asking if we could finally go home. My heart felt lighter than it had in weeks as we walked up the familiar driveway, Emma's small hand in mine, both of us believing that family love would ultimately prevail over anger and disappointment. The setup became apparent the moment we walked through the front door. Instead of the intimate family discussion I'd expected, I found myself facing what could only be described as an intervention. My parents sat stiffly on the couch, flanked by Isabella and her husband, while Miguel stood near the fireplace with a folder of official-looking documents. Father Martinez from our parish sat in my father's favorite chair, his presence immediately signaling that this wasn't about reconciliation but about saving my soul through surrender. The trap had been perfectly laid, and I'd walked into it eagerly, bringing my innocent daughter along to witness whatever humiliation they'd planned. The coordinated nature of their attack became clear as each family member played their assigned role. My father spoke about family reputation and community standing, how my continued pregnancy would affect his business, and their social relationships. Isabella had prepared a presentation about a lovely couple she knew who were desperately wanting to adopt, people with financial stability and moral values who could provide both children with opportunities one could never offer. Miguel's legal documents outlined the process for voluntary relinquishment, carefully worded to sound like a loving sacrifice rather than forced surrender. The priest spoke about redemption through selfless acts and how true maternal love sometimes meant making impossible choices for a child's welfare. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound could have. My mother, who I trusted with my desperation and vulnerability, had orchestrated this entire manipulation while pretending to offer support and understanding. Every tear she'd shed during our phone conversations had been calculated theater, designed to keep me hopeful enough to walk voluntarily into their trap. As I clutched Emma protectively while they explained their plan for both my children's futures, I realized that my family's love had always been conditional on my compliance with their expectations, and they were willing to destroy me completely rather than accept my autonomous choices as an adult woman. The part-time position at the community center felt like winning the lottery after months of unemployment and desperation. Maria had recommended me to the director based on my previous experience and her observations of how I interacted with other shelter residents facing similar challenges. Working with families in crisis gave me purpose beyond survival while providing the steady income needed to start rebuilding our lives on solid ground. Emma's enrollment in the subsidized preschool program attached to the center meant she was receiving quality early childhood education while I was working, surrounded by caring professionals who understood that children from unstable housing situations need extra attention and support to thrive academically and socially. The prenatal classes I attended through the community health clinic helped me prepare for my second child's arrival while connecting me with other mothers facing various challenges in their pregnancies and family situations. These women became my first real friendships since my family's rejection, relationships built on mutual support rather than judgment about past choices or current circumstances. Sharing experiences with mothers who understood financial stress, family rejection, and single parenthood created a bond that felt more genuine than many relationships I'd maintained with people who'd never faced serious adversity or questioned their support systems. The growing support network extended beyond other struggling mothers to include community professionals who saw potential in my situation rather than just problems requiring management. Sandra Williams, the African-American director of the community center, had built her career helping families transition from crisis to stability, and she recognized qualities in me that I'd forgotten I possessed during months of constant defeat. Her mentorship went beyond employment guidance to include personal development, helping me understand that my experiences could become strengths rather than permanent limitations if I chose to learn from them rather than simply survive them. The volunteer lawyer Jennifer Chin appeared in my life through Sandra's connections, offering family law expertise that had previously been financially impossible to access. Her initial consultation revealed that my family's systematic efforts to isolate and impoverish me might actually constitute harassment and emotional abuse under legal definitions, potentially providing grounds for restraining orders and other protections if their interference continued. More importantly, she explained my parental rights in language that emphasized my authority to make decisions about my children's welfare rather than my family's claims about superior judgment and resources. The healthcare workers at the clinic provided compassionate care that restored my faith in professional relationships after months of dealing with bureaucrats who treated me like a case number rather than a human being facing extraordinary circumstances.
Dr.
Sarah Kim, my obstetrician, understood that stress during pregnancy affected both physical health and emotional well-being, adjusting my care plan to address the trauma I'd experienced while ensuring my baby's healthy development. The nurses remembered Emma's name and asked about her preschool progress, treating my daughter like a valued member of our healthcare team rather than an inconvenience during medical appointments. The false hope of reconciliation began when Miguel appeared at the community center unexpectedly, claiming he'd been thinking about our family situation and questioning whether they'd handled things appropriately. His professional demeanor seemed softer somehow, and he spoke about missing Emma and wondering if there might be ways to rebuild relationships that would benefit everyone involved. The conversation felt different from our previous interactions, less focused on legal threats and reputation management, more concerned with actual family bonds and long-term consequences of permanent estrangement. When he mentioned that our parents had been asking about Emma and expressing regret about the harsh way things had been handled, I allowed myself to hope that family love might eventually overcome pride and anger. The invitation to Isabella's daughter's birthday party came through Miguel, presented as an olive branch from the family who wanted to test whether reconciliation was possible without making formal commitments that might backfire if old conflicts resurged. He explained that they understood my need for independence and respected my choices about the pregnancy, but they wanted Emma to know her cousins and maintain connections with her extended family despite the adults' disagreements. The party would be a neutral setting where everyone could interact naturally and see whether enough common ground existed to rebuild damaged relationships without addressing past hurts that might be better left unexamined. I spent money I couldn't afford on a beautiful dress for Emma and a thoughtful gift for my niece, wanting our appearance to demonstrate that we were thriving despite the challenges they'd witnessed during our lowest points. Emma's excitement about seeing her cousins again and meeting her new aunt's friends filled our apartment with joy as she practiced songs she wanted to sing and stories she wanted to tell about her preschool adventures. The anticipation felt healing somehow, as if looking forward to family connection was repairing damage I hadn't realized extended beyond our immediate relationship to Emma's sense of belonging in the wider world. The The party setup became apparent the moment we arrived at Isabella's elaborately decorated backyard, where extended family members and family friends had gathered not for a normal birthday celebration, but for what could only be described as a public trial of my character and choices. The guest list included neighbors, church members, and family friends who'd heard various versions of my story, but never directly interacted with me during my struggles, creating an audience for whatever performance my family had planned. Emma sensed the tension immediately, clinging to my hand instead of running toward her cousins as she'd anticipated during our drive to the party. The public shaming began subtly, with Isabella introducing me to guests as her sister, who'd been going through some difficult times lately, a description that invited questions about my situation, while positioning her as the successful sister offering charity to her less fortunate sibling. My father delivered a speech about family loyalty and forgiveness that sounded generous to unfamiliar ears, but carried undertones of judgment and conditional acceptance that made my skin crawl. The extended family members who'd previously treated Emma as a beloved grandchild now seemed cautious around her, as if my supposed instability might be contagious or her presence might create awkwardness they preferred to avoid. The orchestrated exclusion of Emma from the children's activities was the cruelest element of their manipulation. While other children played games and participated in organized activities, Emma was subtly redirected towards solitary play or adult conversations, effectively isolating her from the peer interaction she'd been excited to enjoy. Isabella's children, who'd once adored their cousin, now seemed coached to maintain polite distance, creating confusion for Emma, who couldn't understand why family relationships that had once felt natural now required navigation of unspoken rules and careful boundaries. The cruelest revelation emerged when I discovered that Miguel had been secretly recording our interactions throughout the family reconciliation process, gathering footage that could be edited to support their legal case for custody if they decided to pursue that option. The hidden cameras at the party were positioned to capture any moments where Emma appeared less than perfectly happy, or where I might seem overwhelmed or inappropriate in my responses to their orchestrated social pressure. Every conversation, every interaction, every spontaneous moment of affection between Emma and me was being documented as potential evidence in court proceedings I didn't know were still being considered. The prepared legal documents hidden in gift boxes revealed the true purpose of the birthday party invitation. While guests enjoyed cake and watched children play, my family had planned to present me with custody papers disguised as presents, creating maximum public pressure to sign documents that would transfer Emma to Isabella's care while absolving them of responsibility for my second child. The elaborate celebration was actually a trap designed to make my refusal seem unreasonable and selfish in front of witnesses who would later testify about my unwillingness to consider my daughter's best interests when presented with superior alternatives. Emma's trauma from the cousin's rejection and the adult's strange behavior around her became the final straw that broke through my desperate hope for family reconciliation. Watching my 3-year-old daughter try to understand why children who'd once played with her freely now seemed afraid to engage, why adults who'd once picked her up and showered her with affection now maintained careful distance, I realized that my family's conditional love was damaging her understanding of relationships and self-worth. The dramatic exit from the party, shielding Emma from further emotional harm while my family called after us with false concern about overreaction and missed opportunities, marked the end of my attempts to preserve connections that required us to accept treatment beneath basic human dignity. The intervention escalated rapidly as my family realized I wasn't going to cooperate with their carefully orchestrated plan. My father's reasonable tone disappeared completely when I firmly refused to even look at the adoption papers Miguel had prepared, replaced by the same volcanic anger that had erupted during my pregnancy announcement. His voice echoed through the living room as he declared that I was being selfish and irresponsible, thinking only of my own stubborn pride rather than what was best for my children. Isabella jumped in with her practiced presentation about the wonderful couple she'd found, describing their beautiful home, stable income, and desperate desire for children in such glowing terms that she made my own love sound inadequate by comparison. The legal pressure intensified when Miguel stepped forward with his folder of documents, explaining in his cold, professional voice how easy the process would be if I simply signed the papers voluntarily. He outlined scenarios where fighting their plan would result in lengthy custody battles that would drain any resources I might scrape together while traumatizing Emma through court proceedings and home investigations. The threat was clear even though he never stated it directly. My family had the financial resources and community connections to take my children through legal means if I didn't surrender them willingly. Father Martinez added moral weight to their arguments, speaking about sacrificial love and how sometimes God calls us to make choices that break our hearts for the greater good. My resistance only made them more determined and cruel in their approach. Isabella revealed that they'd been gathering evidence of my struggles for weeks, documenting every missed bill, every temporary housing arrangement, every moment when Emma had appeared less than perfectly cared for in their observation. She spoke about neighbors reporting that Emma seemed tired and cranky, about how I'd been seen at food banks and charity organizations, about medical appointments I'd missed due to transportation or financial issues. Each detail felt like a violation, proof that my family had been surveilling my life while pretending to offer support through my mother's phone calls. The community pressure they'd orchestrated became apparent as they revealed the extent of their campaign against me. My father had been speaking with neighbors and business associates about my situation, framing my choices as evidence of moral failure and poor judgment that reflected badly on their family values. Church members had been told carefully crafted versions of my story that emphasized my repeated poor choices in men while minimizing any mention of abandonment or my efforts to provide for Emma independently. Former friends were avoiding me not out of natural drifting, but because they'd been told things about my character and stability that made them question their previous support. The financial trap they'd constructed was more sophisticated than I'd realized. Miguel revealed that my late grandmother's trust fund, which should have been accessible to me for educational expenses or family emergencies, had been frozen through legal maneuvering that questioned my competency to manage money responsibly. My father's extensive business connections had been quietly informed about my situation in ways that made employers hesitant to hire someone whose own family couldn't vouch for their reliability or moral character. Isabella's influence in the community had even reached Emma's daycare, where subtle questions about our stability had led to concerns about continued enrollment if our account fell further behind. The systematic isolation became clear as they outlined how thoroughly they'd cut off my support systems. Friends who might have helped were hearing carefully edited versions of my story that emphasized my poor choices while omitting details about their own role in creating my desperate circumstances. Community organizations that might have provided assistance were being told by respected family members that I was uncooperative and looking for handouts rather than taking responsibility for my situation. Even potential employers were receiving subtle warnings about my character and reliability from people whose opinions carried weight in our interconnected community. The cruelest revelation came when my mother finally spoke, admitting that the entire reconciliation effort had been her idea rather than my father's grudging compromise. Carmen explained tearfully how she'd initiated contact with the adoptive family weeks before my eviction, how she'd been coordinating with Isabella to document my struggles, and how every expression of maternal concern during our phone conversations had been designed to gather information for their legal strategy. The woman who'd given birth to me had been systematically plotting to take away my children while pretending to offer emotional support and hope for family healing. Her fake collapse in the middle of the confrontation was perfectly timed to deflect attention from the moral horror of her betrayal. As she clutched her chest and gasped about the stress of watching me destroy myself and my children, the entire room shifted focus to her supposed medical emergency, while I stood there realizing that even her tears were weapons designed to manipulate my emotions. Miguel immediately began speaking about how my selfishness was literally killing our mother, how my continued resistance to their reasonable solution would result in Carmen's death from stress and heartbreak. The emotional blackmail was so expertly delivered that I almost began to doubt my own perceptions of right and wrong. The adoption meeting they'd arranged became the final insult in their coordinated attack. The prospective parents were waiting in Isabella's dining room, having been told that I was a troubled but ultimately loving mother who wanted what was best for my children. These well-meaning people had prepared for a grateful birth mother who would appreciate their offer to provide opportunities one couldn't give my children, not realizing they were participants in my family's scheme to forcibly separate me from my babies. When I refused to meet with them, my family's disappointment focused not on the couple's wasted time but on my continued stubbornness in refusing to see reason and accept their superior judgment about my children's futures. The evening ended with Emma crying in confusion as raised voices swirled around her, my own tears of rage and betrayal, and my family's cold determination to proceed with their plan whether I cooperated or not. As I carried my daughter out of that house for what I sensed would be the last time, I could hear them already discussing next steps and alternative strategies for achieving their goals. The people who'd raised me to believe in family loyalty and unconditional love had revealed themselves to be calculating strangers willing to destroy my life to protect their reputation, and I finally understood that I was completely alone in a battle I had never chosen to fight. The homeless shelter intake process stripped away any remaining dignity I'd managed to preserve through months of struggle. Standing in line with Emma while social workers processed our paperwork, I watched my 3-year-old daughter absorb the reality of our situation with the frightening adaptability of children who learn too early that life is unpredictable and unsafe. The questions were invasive and humiliating, designed to determine our level of need, while somehow making me feel responsible for every circumstance that had led us to that moment. Other residents eyed us with mixture of sympathy and suspicion, some recognizing fellow victims of family rejection while others wondered what failures had brought a young mother and child to such desperate circumstances. The living conditions challenged everything I'd believed about my ability to protect Emma from harsh realities. Our assigned space was a single bed in a room shared with 3 other families, separated by thin curtains that provided the illusion of privacy while offering none of the security a child needs to feel safe. The sounds of other people's pain echoed through the building day and night, crying babies, arguments between stressed parents, and the constant shuffle of people coming and going as temporary solutions fell through or new crises emerged. Emma's sleep became restless and interrupted, her cheerful chatter replaced by anxious questions about when we could go home and whether the scary sounds meant we were in danger. The competition for resources within the shelter created an environment where desperation brought out both the best and worst in people facing impossible situations. Bathroom time was limited, forcing rushed hygiene routines that left Emma confused about why she couldn't take her usual long baths with toys and bubbles. Meals were provided but rarely accommodated the specific needs of pregnant women or picky toddlers, leaving me constantly worried about proper nutrition for both my growing baby and Emma's developing body. The shelter's rules were strict and numerous, designed to maintain order among people who'd lost control over most aspects of their lives, but Emma's 3-year-old understanding couldn't grasp why she wasn't allowed to play loudly or move freely through the building. The health crisis that sent me to the emergency room came without warning during our 2nd week in the shelter. Severe cramping and bleeding during my 2nd trimester terrified me beyond rational thought, especially when the doctors couldn't immediately determine whether the stress of our situation was causing pregnancy complications that might end in miscarriage. The emergency foster care placement for Emma while I was hospitalized added another layer of trauma to our already overwhelming circumstances, separating us when we most needed each other's comfort and stability. The foster family was kind but strange to Emma, who didn't understand why Mommy had disappeared again and whether this time I might not come back at all. My family's refusal to take emergency custody of Emma during my hospitalization revealed the true depth of their rejection. The social worker called my parents first, explaining that Emma needed temporary placement with family while her mother recovered from pregnancy-related medical complications, giving them an opportunity to demonstrate that their anger was directed at me rather than their innocent granddaughter. Their flat refusal, delivered through Miguel's professional language about avoiding legal liability and emotional complications, made it clear that Emma was just another casualty in their war against my choices. Isabella also declined, claiming that caring for Emma would be too disruptive to her own children's routines and potentially confusing given the temporary nature of the arrangement. The complete emotional breakdown that followed Emma's foster placement and my family's final rejection left me questioning whether fighting for my children was actually an act of love or selfish stubbornness that would ultimately harm them more than surrender. Lying in that hospital bed, pumping breast milk for a baby I might lose while wondering if my daughter would be better off with people who could provide stability instead of chaos, I reached the darkest point of my entire life. The doctors spoke about stress-induced complications and the importance of emotional stability for healthy pregnancy outcomes, words that felt like accusations about my failure to create appropriate conditions for my unborn child's development. Maria Rodriguez appeared in my life, like an answer to prayers I hadn't even realized I was praying. This 60-year-old Latina woman had been living in the shelter for 8 months following her own family's rejection when her husband died and left her financially destitute despite 40 years of marriage and raising 6 children. Her presence in the emergency room during my crisis wasn't coincidental but deliberate. Maria had been watching over Emma and me since our arrival, recognizing something familiar in our situation that reminded her of her own journey from beloved family member to unwanted burden. Her weathered hands held mine while I sobbed about losing everything, and her voice carried the wisdom of someone who'd survived similar betrayals and lived to find meaning in the aftermath. Maria's own story of family rejection provided both comfort and practical guidance for navigating the impossible choices ahead. Her children had gradually distanced themselves after their father's death, claiming that caring for an elderly mother would interfere with their own family's needs and financial goals. The house she'd lived in for decades was sold to settle debts she'd never known existed, and the children who'd once competed for her attention suddenly became too busy to return phone calls or visit. Like me, she discovered that family love often comes with conditions that become apparent only when circumstances make us inconvenient rather than beneficial to maintain relationships with. The practical survival skills Maria taught me went far beyond the basic resource information provided by shelter staff. She showed me how to navigate social services bureaucracy with dignity intact, which questions to ask and which battles were worth fighting when every interaction felt designed to wear down resistance to their preferred solutions. Her network of other displaced mothers provided both emotional support and practical assistance, women who'd learned to create chosen families when biological ones failed to provide the unconditional love they'd been promised. Through Maria's guidance, I began to understand that survival wasn't just about meeting immediate physical needs, but about maintaining hope that circumstances could improve through persistence and mutual support. The small victories that began during my recovery felt monumental after weeks of constant crisis and defeat. Successfully regaining custody of Emma from her foster placement required proving that I could provide appropriate housing and care, goals that seemed impossible until Maria helped me access resources I hadn't known existed. The transitional housing program she recommended had a waiting list, but her advocacy with the director created an emergency placement that gave Emma and me our own space for the first time since leaving my father's house. The community health clinic she introduced me to provided prenatal care on a sliding fee scale, finally ensuring that my baby was receiving appropriate medical attention despite our financial limitations. Emma's improvement with stability and routine reminded me why fighting for my children was worth every struggle and humiliation we'd endured. Her laughter returned gradually as she realized that our new housing situation wasn't temporary like so many other changes had been, and her questions about grandparents and family became less frequent as she adapted to our smaller but more reliable support system. The moment she stopped asking when we were going home and started calling our transitional apartment home instead marked a turning point in my understanding of what family actually means when stripped of biological connections and social expectations. The legal papers arrived by certified mail exactly 1 week after the disastrous birthday party, confirming my worst fears about my family's true intentions behind their reconciliation attempts. Miguel had filed a formal custody petition claiming that I was an unfit mother whose unstable lifestyle and poor judgment posed ongoing threats to Emma's physical safety and emotional well-being. The legal language was coldly professional, describing my living situation, employment status, and relationship history in terms that made every struggle sound like evidence of fundamental character flaws rather than circumstances beyond my control. The timing was strategically calculated to coincide with my advancing pregnancy, when my energy for fighting legal battles would be at its lowest point and my financial resources most strained. The allegations outlined in the custody petition read like a catalog of every private struggle I'd faced during the past year, information that could only have been gathered through systematic surveillance and deliberate evidence collection by family members who'd pretended to offer support. They cited my temporary homelessness as proof of inability to provide stable housing, my job loss as evidence of unreliability and poor work ethic, and my pregnancy by another absent father as a pattern of irresponsible behavior that endangered my existing child's welfare. Every medical appointment I'd missed due to transportation issues, every bill that had been paid late due to insufficient funds, every moment of visible stress during our most difficult periods had been documented and preserved as ammunition for their legal assault. The character assassination campaign extended far beyond formal legal proceedings into every corner of our community life. My father's extensive business connections received carefully crafted updates about my situation that emphasized my repeated poor choices while omitting any mention of the family's role in creating or exacerbating my difficulties. Church members were told versions of my story that focused on moral failures and rejection of family guidance, positioning my choices as rebellion against loving attempts to help rather than defensive responses to systematic rejection and abuse. Former friends found themselves approached by family members seeking character references, conversations that planted doubts about my stability and judgment while gathering ammunition for court testimony about my unsuitability as a custodial parent. The medical evidence they'd assembled was particularly devastating because it used legitimate health information taken completely out of context to support false narratives about my mental state and parenting capacity. Emergency room visits during my pregnancy were presented as proof of inability to manage stress appropriately, without mention of the family harassment that had caused much of that stress. Emma's temporary developmental delays during our most unstable housing period were cited as evidence of neglect and inadequate care, ignoring her remarkable recovery once we achieved stable living conditions and consistent routines. Even my prenatal depression, a common condition affecting millions of pregnant women, was characterized as mental illness that impaired my judgment and posed risks to both my children. The pregnancy complications intensified under the crushing stress of legal warfare, creating a vicious cycle where the family's harassment caused health problems that they then cited as evidence of my inadequacy as a mother. High blood pressure and bleeding episodes required bed rest that conflicted with court appearances and custody evaluation appointments, forcing me to choose between my unborn baby's health and my legal defense of Emma's custody. The financial strain of medical bills combined with legal representation costs pushed us deeper into poverty, providing additional ammunition for their claims about my inability to provide adequate resources for my children's needs. Sandra Williams stepped forward as my most vocal advocate during the custody proceedings, using her professional reputation and community connections to provide character references that countered my family's systematic campaign of destruction. Her testimony about my work performance, dedication to Emma's well-being, and remarkable resilience in the face of extraordinary challenges provided the court with an alternative narrative about my character and capabilities. The community center's documentation of my progress from crisis to stability offered concrete evidence that contradicted the family's portrayal of me as chronically unstable and unable to learn from mistakes or accept responsibility for my choices. Jennifer Chen's pro bono representation became crucial as the legal battle intensified and my family's superior financial resources became apparent through their ability to hire expensive attorneys and expert witnesses. Her strategic approach focused on exposing the coordinated nature of my family's harassment campaign while documenting the emotional and financial abuse that had created many of the problems they now cited as evidence of my unfitness. The discovery process revealed the extent of their surveillance and manipulation, including recorded conversations between family members discussing strategies for gathering evidence and creating situations where I would appear overwhelmed or inappropriate in my responses to engineered crises. The court ordered psychological evaluation of all parties involved provided an opportunity to demonstrate that my mental health struggles were situational responses to extraordinary stress rather than chronic conditions that impaired my parenting capacity. Emma's sessions with a child psychologist revealed a bright, emotionally healthy child whose attachment to her mother was strong and whose behavioral issues correlated directly with periods of family harassment rather than problems with my parenting style or capabilities. The evaluator's report noted Emma's clear preference for remaining with me and her distress when discussing potential separation from her primary caregiver and unborn sibling. The most devastating betrayal came when my mother appeared as a witness for the custody petition, testifying against me with false claims about my mental instability and dangerous behavior toward Emma. Carmen took the witness stand with tears streaming down her face, presenting herself as a heartbroken grandmother forced to protect her granddaughter from her own daughter's increasingly erratic and threatening behavior. Her testimony included fabricated stories about violent outbursts, substance abuse, and neglect that never occurred, delivered with such convincing emotion that even I began to doubt my own memories of events she described. The detailed lies my mother told under oath represented the complete destruction of any remaining hope for family reconciliation. She described incidents of violence and neglect that were pure fiction, medical emergencies that had never happened, and conversations that existed only in her imagination or deliberate distortion of actual events. Carmen testified about finding bruises on Emma that suggested abuse, about discovering drug paraphernalia in my belongings, about receiving frightening phone calls where I threatened to harm myself and my children if the family didn't stop interfering with my life. Each lie was carefully constructed to sound plausible while being impossible to disprove without extensive investigation. The medical records my mother referenced in her testimony had been taken out of context or misinterpreted to support false narratives about my mental health and parenting capacity. She claimed that my emergency room visits indicated suicide attempts rather than pregnancy complications, that my prenatal depression was evidence of psychosis rather than a common condition affecting many expectant mothers, and that my stress-related symptoms proved I was unable to cope with basic parenting responsibilities. Her tears during testimony convinced the courtroom that she was a loving grandmother making impossible choices to protect her granddaughter from genuine danger. The temporary custody ruling that followed my mother's testimony was the most devastating blow in a year filled with unimaginable losses. Emma was placed immediately in Isabella's care pending further investigation and evaluation, with my visitation restricted to supervised sessions twice weekly in a sterile family services office. The judge explained that while the allegations were serious and required thorough investigation, the court's primary concern was Emma's immediate safety and stability during the legal proceedings. Watching my daughter cry as she was led away by a court officer while my family stood triumphantly nearby remains the most painful memory of my entire life. The supervised living arrangement requirements imposed by the court added insult to injury by forcing me to accept housing assistance that came with constant oversight and evaluation of my daily activities and choices. Social workers conducted unannounced visits to assess my mental state, housekeeping standards, and compliance with court-ordered parenting classes and counseling sessions. Every aspect of my life became subject to official scrutiny and documentation, creating additional stress that threatened my pregnancy while providing more ammunition for my family's claims about my inability to function independently or maintain appropriate standards of self-care and environmental management. The complete devastation that followed losing custody of Emma pushed me into the darkest period of my entire life, when the will to continue fighting seemed futile against my family's superior resources and systematic destruction of everything I'd worked to build. The supervised visitation sessions twice weekly became exercises in controlled torture, watching my daughter's confusion and distress while maintaining appropriate behavior under constant observation by social workers who documented every interaction for potential use in court proceedings. Emma's questions about when she could come home, why she couldn't sleep in her own bed, and whether Mommy still loved her despite the strange new arrangement cut through my heart like physical wounds that never had time to heal between visits. The suicidal thoughts that emerged during this period felt like logical conclusions rather than symptoms of depression, convincing arguments that Emma would be better off without a mother whose love had brought nothing but instability and trauma into her young life. The mental health hospitalization that followed my breakdown provided safety from impulses I couldn't control alone, but it also created additional evidence for my family's claims about my fundamental unfitness as a parent and caregiver. The irony was crushing. Seeking help for emotional crisis caused by their harassment became proof that their harassment was justified, creating an inescapable cycle where every attempt at self-care was twisted into evidence of the problems they'd created through their systematic abuse. The second pregnancy complications requiring bed rest created impossible conflicts between my unborn child's medical needs and the court's requirements for maintaining parental fitness and compliance with custody arrangements. Missing supervised visitation sessions due to doctors' orders about strict bed rest meant disappointing Emma, while providing ammunition for claims that I prioritized my new pregnancy over my existing child's emotional needs. The stress of choosing between my baby's competing needs intensified my physical symptoms while demonstrating how my family's legal warfare was literally threatening the lives of both my children through emotional and physiological trauma. Emma's suffering in Isabella's care became apparent through subtle changes in her behavior and emotional state during our brief supervised visits. My once cheerful, outgoing daughter had become withdrawn and anxious, asking repeated questions about rules and consequences that suggested she was walking on eggshells in her temporary home. Isabella's strict discipline and emotional coldness, disguised as appropriate structure and boundaries, was crushing Emma's natural exuberance and replacing it with fearful compliance. The reports I received through social workers about Emma's crying herself to sleep and asking constantly for her real mommy provided confirmation that my family's solution was harming the very child they claimed to be protecting. The investigation process, led by Jennifer Chin, uncovered the systematic nature of my family's campaign against me, revealing patterns of harassment and manipulation that extended far beyond typical custody disputes. Documentation of their surveillance activities, recorded conversations about strategy sessions, and evidence of coordinated community gossip campaigns began building a case for malicious prosecution and emotional abuse that might ultimately work in my favor if we could survive the immediate crisis. The discovery that Miguel had been abusing his position as an attorney to access records and resources beyond normal legal boundaries provided additional ammunition for defending against their custody petition, while potentially exposing him to professional sanctions. Detective Mark Thompson entered my life through his investigation of harassment reports I'd filed against my family, bringing law enforcement perspective to behavior patterns that civilians might dismiss as typical family conflict. His experience with domestic abuse cases helped him recognize the systematic isolation, financial manipulation, and emotional warfare tactics my family had employed, understanding that abuse within families often escalates when victims attempt to establish independence or resist control. Mark's informal protection and advice about documenting threats and maintaining personal safety provided practical guidance for surviving the ongoing legal battle while protecting myself and my unborn child from further harm. Mark's investigation revealed disturbing information about my family's methods and motivations that went beyond simple custody concerns to encompass patterns of controlling behavior and potential criminal harassment. The discovery of my father's business connections being used for intimidation purposes, Miguel's abuse of legal resources for personal vendettas, and my mother's history of manipulating family relationships for control provided context for understanding their current behavior as escalation of long-standing patterns rather than isolated responses to my pregnancy situation. The evidence that Isabella's motivation included financial benefits from gaining custody added another layer of complexity to their supposed concern for Emma's welfare. The birth of my second daughter, Sophia, during this crisis period brought both joy and terror, as I feared immediate custody loss while celebrating the arrival of my beautiful, healthy baby. The premature delivery caused by stress complications required specialized medical care that insurance barely covered, adding financial pressure to emotional trauma while providing additional evidence my family could use to claim I was unable to provide appropriate medical care for my children. The hospital staff's compassionate protection of our mother-child bonding time and their support for breastfeeding despite my stress levels provided crucial early experiences that strengthened my determination to keep fighting for both my daughters' futures. Maria's presence during Sophia's birth as my chosen family support person marked a turning point in my understanding of what family relationships could look like when based on mutual care rather than conditional approval. Her steady presence during labor and delivery, her practical help with newborn care, and her emotional support during the overwhelming combination of joy and fear provided the strength needed to face whatever legal challenges lay ahead. The moment when Maria held Sophia, while I pumped breast milk and planned strategies for protecting both my children, crystallized my resolve to create a chosen family capable of providing love and stability regardless of biological family rejection. The turning point evidence that Mark uncovered included recorded conversations between my family members revealing their true motivations and methods, providing legal ammunition that could potentially expose their conspiracy and reverse the custody arrangements that were harming Emma while threatening Sophia's future. Miguel's admission that they'd fabricated evidence for court proceedings, Isabella's confession about financial motivations for seeking custody, and my father's threats against community members who might support me created a foundation for fighting back against their systematic campaign. The preparation for presenting this evidence in court required careful strategy and timing to maximize impact while minimizing potential backlash against the people who'd helped gather information about my family's illegal activities. The legal momentum began shifting dramatically when Jennifer Chun presented the evidence of my family's conspiracy and systematic harassment to the family court judge who'd initially granted their custody petition. The recorded conversations between Miguel, Isabella, and my parents revealed not only the fabricated nature of many allegations against me, but also their calculated planning to destroy my reputation and financial stability, regardless of the impact on Emma's well-being. Miguel's admission on tape that they'd exaggerated or invented several incidents of neglect and abuse provided clear evidence of perjury and malicious prosecution that undermined their credibility while supporting my claims of coordinated family harassment. Detective Mark Thompson's official testimony carried significant weight with the court because his investigation had uncovered evidence of criminal harassment and potential conspiracy that extended beyond typical family disputes into territory requiring law enforcement intervention. His documentation of my family's surveillance activities, intimidation tactics, and systematic isolation efforts provided professional perspective on behavior patterns that civilian witnesses might not recognize as coordinated abuse. The police report detailing threats made against Sandra Williams and Maria Rodriguez for supporting me demonstrated how my family's campaign had expanded to target anyone who challenged their narrative about my character and fitness as a mother. The medical professionals who testified about my pregnancy complications and stress-related health issues provided crucial context for understanding how my family's harassment had created many of the problems they subsequently cited as evidence of my unfitness.
Dr.
Sarah Kim's testimony explained how the systematic stress of legal battles, financial manipulation, and emotional abuse had directly caused pregnancy complications that required medical intervention, effectively proving that my family's actions had endangered both my health and my unborn child's development. The pediatrician who'd been treating Emma documented the child's improved behavior and emotional stability during periods when family harassment decreased, providing clear correlation between their interference and my daughter's well-being. The community members who came forward to testify about my character and parenting abilities provided powerful counter-narratives to my family's campaign of destruction. Sandra Williams' professional testimony about my work performance and dedication to helping other families in crisis demonstrated capabilities that contradicted claims about my instability and poor judgment. Other single mothers from our support group shared observations about my parenting during our most difficult periods, providing witness accounts of my patience, creativity, and fierce protectiveness toward Emma despite extraordinary circumstances that would challenge any parent's resources and emotional reserves. Emma's heartbreaking testimony to the child advocate about wanting to return to her mother and baby sister provided the most compelling evidence that the custody arrangement was harming rather than protecting her. The court-appointed specialist reported that Emma consistently expressed preference for living with me, demonstrated strong attachment to her primary caregiver role in my life, and showed signs of emotional distress related to separation from her normal routine and support system. Her simple request to go home to mommy and help take care of baby Sophia carried more weight than any expert testimony about theoretical best interests or financial stability comparisons. My family's desperate escalation in response to the shifting legal momentum revealed the depths of their determination to win at any cost, regardless of collateral damage to Emma's emotional well-being or my newborn daughter's future security. My father's direct threats against Sandra and Maria represented criminal behavior that provided additional grounds for restraining orders while demonstrating how far beyond normal family conflict their campaign had progressed. Miguel's increasingly desperate attempts to discredit evidence through legal technicalities and procedural challenges showed his willingness to abuse his professional position and legal knowledge to protect family interests rather than serving justice or his client's legitimate needs. Isabella's emotional manipulation of Emma during supervised visits represented child abuse disguised as concern, as she pressured my daughter to express preferences for staying in her temporary home while subtly threatening consequences if Emma admitted wanting to return to me. The documentation of these inappropriate conversations during visitation provided evidence that the temporary custody arrangement was being used to manipulate Emma's testimony rather than protect her welfare. My sister's increasing desperation as the legal tide turned against them led to more obvious manipulation attempts that social workers began documenting as potential emotional abuse of the child they claimed to be protecting. The dramatic court hearing where all evidence was presented felt like watching my entire life being dissected and reconstructed by legal professionals who held the power to determine my family's future. The judge's growing recognition of the malicious prosecution became apparent through increasingly sharp questions directed at my family's legal representation and visible skepticism toward testimony that contradicted documented evidence of their coordinated campaign. The moment when Miguel was forced to admit under oath that certain allegations had been exaggerated for legal impact marked the beginning of their credibility collapse and vindication of my claims about systematic harassment and abuse. The court's immediate reversal of the custody decision and Emma's joyful reunion with me and baby Sophia represented justice finally prevailing over manipulation and financial resources. Watching my older daughter hold her baby sister for the first time while we sat together in our own home again provided healing that no legal victory could match. The restraining orders issued against all family members created legal protection from future harassment while formally recognizing that their behavior constituted abuse rather than legitimate concern for their granddaughter's welfare. The beginning of our healing process as a reunited family marked the end of one nightmare and the start of building something better from the ruins of everything they'd tried to destroy. The final desperate moves by my family to avoid consequences for their actions revealed character flaws that extended far beyond their treatment of me to encompass dishonesty and manipulation in their business and professional relationships. My father's business bankruptcy filing to avoid paying legal damages and court costs demonstrated willingness to harm employees and business partners rather than accept responsibility for the financial consequences of his harassment campaign. Miguel's ethics investigation by the State Bar Association for abusing legal resources and professional position in pursuing personal vendettas threatened his career, while providing public vindication that his behavior had crossed professional and ethical boundaries. Isabella's social isolation as community members learned the truth about her role in manipulating Emma and fabricating evidence created consequences that extended beyond legal penalties to encompass loss of social standing and reputation she'd worked years to build. Her attempts to portray herself as a victim of my supposedly vengeful legal tactics fell flat when confronted with documentation of her active participation in destroying my reputation and attempting to permanently separate me from my children. My mother's complete mental breakdown and psychiatric hospitalization following the court's ruling provided sad confirmation that her participation in the conspiracy had been motivated by psychological issues that required professional treatment rather than genuine concern for her granddaughter's welfare. The sixth and final betrayal came from extended family members and family friends who chose to maintain loyalty to my father despite clear evidence of his role in orchestrating systematic harassment and child abuse disguised as custody concerns. Grandparents, Aunts, uncles, and family friends who'd known me since childhood accepted the false narratives my parents had created rather than questioning obvious inconsistencies or supporting my efforts to protect my children from ongoing manipulation and abuse. Their continued exclusion and social rejection after the truth became public demonstrated how deeply conditional their love had always been and how willing people could be to sacrifice justice for social comfort and established relationships. The complete severing of all family connections that followed the legal victory felt both liberating and devastating, as I finally accepted that the people who'd raised me had never actually known or loved the person I truly was beneath their expectations and demands for compliance. The necessity of starting completely over with no family support while caring for two young children seemed overwhelming despite our legal protections and growing chosen family network. The recognition that Emma would grow up knowing her maternal grandparents, aunt, and uncle only as people who tried to separate our family rather than loving relatives created sadness that would take years to process and heal from completely. The healing journey that began after our legal victory required patience and professional guidance to address the trauma Emma and I had both experienced during months of systematic harassment and family warfare designed to destroy our bond and sense of security. The therapy sessions with Dr. Lisa Chun, a specialist in family trauma and parental alienation, provided safe space for Emma to express her confusion about the adult's behavior while helping me understand how to support my daughter's emotional recovery without burdening her with inappropriate adult information about the family's motivations and methods. Learning to trust the therapeutic process after months of having every word and action scrutinized for legal purposes required rebuilding confidence in professional relationships and accepting help without fear of judgment or manipulation. Emma's processing of the family trauma manifested in age-appropriate ways that required careful attention and response to prevent long-term damage to her ability to form healthy relationships and trust adult caregivers. Her questions about why grandparents and family members had acted mean toward us led to delicate conversations about how sometimes adults make poor choices when they're scared or angry, without providing details that would traumatize her further or create additional confusion about family relationships. The play therapy sessions helped Emma work through feelings about the separation and reunion while developing coping skills for managing anxiety about potential future separations or family conflicts. The support group participation with other abuse survivors provided both emotional validation and practical guidance for rebuilding life after systematic trauma designed to destroy sense of self-worth and capability. Meeting other mothers who'd survived family rejection, domestic abuse, and legal harassment created understanding that my experiences weren't unique or evidence of personal failure, but part of larger patterns of how controlling families respond when members attempt to establish independence or resist manipulation. The shared strategies for healing, protecting children, and building chosen family networks provided roadmap for moving beyond survival mode into actually thriving despite the absence of biological family support. Building self-worth after months of systematic attacks on my character, parenting ability, and basic human dignity required conscious effort to replace internalized criticism with realistic assessment of my strengths and accomplishments under extraordinary circumstances. The daily practice of acknowledging small victories, from successfully managing Emma's bedtime routine to providing nutritious meals on limited budget, helped rebuild confidence in my ability to care for my children appropriately despite my family's propaganda campaign. Learning to accept compliments and support from chosen family members without immediately questioning their motives or waiting for conditions to be imposed marked significant progress in healing from systematic manipulation and emotional abuse. The chosen family traditions we created with Maria, Sandra, Jennifer, and Mark provided Emma and Sophia with experience of adults who offered unconditional love and support without demands for compliance or gratitude beyond basic courtesy and respect. Our Thanksgiving dinner, that first year after the legal victory, included everyone who'd stood by us during our darkest period, creating new traditions based on gratitude for survival and mutual support rather than obligation or blood relationships. Emma's birthday parties with friends from preschool and adults from our support network demonstrated how families could be built through choice and commitment rather than accident of birth or social expectations. Sophia's first steps were celebrated by our entire chosen family network, providing my younger daughter with early experiences of community love and support that would shape her understanding of normal family relationships. Unlike Emma, who remembered the trauma of family rejection and custody battles, Sophia would grow up knowing only stable, loving relationships with adults who'd chosen to be present in her life rather than feeling obligated by biological connections. The contrast between my daughter's early experiences highlighted how breaking cycles of conditional love could provide future generations with healthier foundations for their own relationship choices. My professional growth at the community center from part-time employee to program coordinator reflected healing and increased confidence while providing opportunities to help other families facing similar challenges with systematic support rather than individual charity. Speaking at conferences about family abuse, single parenthood, and legal advocacy allowed me to transform my trauma into education that might prevent other mothers from experiencing similar systematic destruction of their families and support systems. The policy changes I contributed to regarding family court protections and domestic abuse recognition provided systemic improvements that extended my impact beyond individual cases to potentially help thousands of families facing similar manipulation and harassment. The mentoring relationships with other women facing family rejection created opportunities to share hard-won wisdom about survival strategies, legal protections, and community resource navigation, while continuing my own healing through helping others overcome similar challenges. Each mother I worked with reminded me how far I'd traveled from the desperate woman who'd stood in that shelter intake line with Emma, unsure whether fighting for my children was selfish stubbornness or necessary protection of their future well-being. The transformation from victim to advocate provided purpose that extended beyond personal survival to encompass broader social justice concerns about family abuse and children's rights. The unexpected reconciliation attempts that came as my family faced consequences for their actions tested my boundaries and commitment to protecting my children from further manipulation, disguised as loving concern. My mother's letters from psychiatric treatment facility claimed regret and mental illness as explanations for her participation in systematic harassment, requesting opportunities to rebuild relationships with her granddaughters without acknowledging the ongoing danger her presence would pose to our stability. Isabella's apology attempts through intermediaries emphasized her own stress and family pressure rather than accepting responsibility for her active role in trying to permanently separate me from my children through fabricated evidence and legal manipulation. Miguel's professional consequences, including suspension of his law license and potential criminal charges for abusing his position, led to desperate attempts to negotiate private settlements that would avoid further legal exposure while potentially providing financial compensation for damages his family had caused. The pressure from extended family members and former friends to accept these reconciliation offers tested my resolve to prioritize my children's safety and emotional well-being over social pressure and financial temptation. The decision to maintain no-contact boundaries required ongoing strength and support from chosen family members who understood that forgiveness didn't require exposing my children to continued risk of manipulation and emotional abuse. The wisdom gained through surviving systematic family destruction included understanding that biological relationships don't guarantee love, loyalty, or appropriate behavior, while chosen family connections based on mutual respect and genuine care often provide more stability and emotional safety than traditional family structures. The recognition of my own strength, developed through adversity that would have destroyed less determined people, created confidence in my ability to protect my children and build the life we deserve despite any future challenges or obstacles. The appreciation for chosen families' unconditional support deepened my commitment to providing the same quality of love and loyalty to others facing similar rejection and systematic abuse from people who should have protected them. Looking toward the future with Emma entering school and Sophia beginning to walk and talk provided hope that extended far beyond our immediate survival to encompass dreams of their education, career possibilities, and relationship choices based on healthy examples rather than trauma and manipulation. Emma's college fund, growing slowly but steadily through my stable income, represented investment in possibilities that my own family had tried to destroy through their custody battles and character assassination campaigns. Sophia's bright future with loving mother and sister provided motivation for continued growth and advocacy work that would ensure no other family faced similar systematic destruction without support and legal protection. The new romantic relationship I eventually developed with David, a social worker I met through advocacy work, demonstrated healing sufficient to trust another person with knowledge of my children's well-being and our family's security. Unlike my previous relationships with men who'd abandoned their responsibilities, David's commitment proved itself through consistent presence during both good times and challenging moments, providing Emma and Sophia with positive male role model while supporting my continued growth and professional development. The relationship built on equality and mutual respect showed my daughters what healthy partnerships looked like, while proving that my family's predictions about my inability to maintain stable relationships had been wrong. The final reflection on my journey from disgraceful single mother to respected advocate and loving parent revealed that their rejection had actually freed me to become my authentic self rather than continuing to sacrifice my values and children's well-being for their approval and social acceptance. The realization that being called disgraceful had led me to discover true grace through chosen family relationships, and community service provided perspective that transformed trauma into triumph and pain into purpose. Understanding that their rejection had been motivated by their own limitations rather than my inadequacies created peace with choices that had once caused agonizing self-doubt and guilt about failing to meet their expectations. The encouragement I offer to others facing family rejection emphasizes that chosen family can provide stronger, more reliable support than biological family when blood relationships become toxic or manipulative rather than loving and supportive. The reminder that community support and professional help can overcome even systematic family destruction provides hope for people currently trapped in situations that seem hopeless and overwhelming. The emphasis on prioritizing children's well-being over family approval creates permission for other parents to make difficult choices about protecting their children from relatives whose love comes with conditions that ultimately harm rather than help family relationships. Has your family ever made you choose between their approval and your children's well-being? Share your thoughts in the comments below about whether blood family or chosen family has provided more support during your difficult times. If this story resonated with your own experiences, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories about overcoming family trauma and building the life you deserve. Don't forget to share this with anyone who might need to hear that they're not alone in facing family rejection and that it's possible to not just survive but thrive when you prioritize your children's needs over toxic family expectations. Thank you for listening to my story and for being part of a community that believes love should never come with conditions that destroy your sense of worth. I hope you find the strength to choose your family wisely and the courage to protect what matters most, even when that choice comes with the price of disappointing people who should have supported you unconditionally. Remember that true family stands by you during your worst moments, not just your best ones, and you deserve nothing less than that kind of love and loyalty in your life.